fourth keynote speaker is Silver University professor and professor of philosophy and mathematics at New York University. It's, of course, Kit Fine. His areas of specialization are in metaphysics, maybe we should say general metaphysics now that we're at this conference, logic and philosophy of language, but he's also ventured in a variety of more, let's say, more specialized fields in philosophy, such as ancient philosophy and linguistics. His publications, his many publications, include a number of books. Let me just mention those from this century. There's Did you hear how I didn't want to go there and still went there? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm doing well. Holly, what you say? Okay, there's The Limits of Abstraction from 2002, a collection of papers entitled Modality and Tense from 2005, and then the volume that grew out of his Locke lectures, I believe, Semantic Relationalism, published in 2007. Welcome, and we're pleasure to have you here. Looking forward to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? I'm greatly honored to be here. I'm also greatly surprised. I know next to nothing about social philosophy, and I'm also probably the most anti-social philosopher you'll ever meet. Should it be possible to meet an anti-social philosopher? All the same, I hope that what I have to say from my lofty metaphysical heights may be of some interest to you. I'm going to be talking about a hylomorphic account of social groups. That is an account according to which social groups are some sort of compound of form and matter. I should mention that some other people have developed such views. In fact, a couple of them are here. There's Asya Pasinski. And also, I just learned on Wednesday that Roberto Ferrario and Daniele Prello have also developed such an account within the context of something called the situation calculus, which is a device that computer scientists have developed for reasoning about change. Okay. Anyway, I hope I have something to add to what they've already said. I'm of the opinion, along with a number of other philosophers, that social groups and institutions are of the same general nature as material things. The differences, insofar as they exist, are intra rather than extra categorical. Thus, if we wish to understand what it is to be a member of a group, or to understand how a group can change its members while remaining the same, or to understand how two groups can have the very same members, then the answers we give will be essentially the same as the answers we will give to the questions as to what it is to be a constituent of a material thing, or how a material thing can change its constitution over time, or how two material things can have the very same material constitution. So, in other words, I don't think there's a special question here. I've attempted to answer these questions in the case of material things in some earlier work. This is what I call the theory of embodiment, but this is metaphysical embodiment. My view, roughly speaking, is that there are three basic operations by which material things may be formed from some underlying matter. One of these is the familiar operation of compounding or fusion, whereby two or more things may combine to form a sum. We have an apple and we have an orange, and we have the apple and orange, the sum. The other two operations are less familiar, and their admission constitutes a fundamental departure from standard mereological doctrine. According to standard mereological doctrine, there's just fusion. That's the only way you can form a whole. I call them rigid and variable embodiment. Rigid embodiment is an operation whereby various objects are combined into a whole whose component parts bear certain properties or stand in certain relations to one another. Thus, the component parts are not merely fused, but integrated into some kind of structured whole. We can imagine that a sort of string around the components. Variable embodiment, on the other hand, is an operation whereby we may form an object that is manifested as different, more particular objects at different times or in different counterfactual circumstances. So it's an operation that determines how an enduring object is manifested in different ways at different times or in different counterfactual circumstances. Thus, the one operation accounts for the constitution of the object at a time, while the other accounts for the actual or possible changes in its constitution or in how it's manifested. In the case of social groups, or perhaps of social objects in general, I'm not sure how far to go, we may take the underlying matter to consist of people and of various other objects that may be party to their social interaction, such as buildings and geographical locations, and perhaps also various kinds of normative or cultural artifact. So these are the building blocks, so to speak. Of course, these objects in their turn may have an analysis in terms of other objects, but this further analysis will be irrelevant to our understanding of social objects as social objects. I'm constituted by molecules, but from a social point of view, who cares? My view, therefore, is that social groups, or perhaps social objects in general, should be reviewed as the result of applying these various fundamental operations to the underlying matter of the social world. Consider a married couple, John and Mary. On my view, this will be a rigid embodiment composed of John and Mary, which is not simply the unstructured fusion of John and Mary, but a structured whole in which John stands in the relation of being married to Mary. So John and Mary, just as a fusion, would exist even if they weren't married. But the couple, the married couple, John and Mary, only exists if they are married. So that's one big difference between the rigid embodiment, this structured whole, and the unstructured fusion. Or consider a nuclear family. I'm afraid this is a traditional family. This will consist of John and Mary, say, and their various children. But its constitution can vary from time to time as new children are born. Thus it will be, and of course perhaps the parents can change as well, but let's not go there. Thus it will be a variable embodiment whose manifestations are various rigid embodiments. So at one time, the rigid embodiment will be the parents and the children who exist at that time, related as parents and children, which in their turn are structured wholes in which two of its members are spouses of one another, and which the other members are the children of those spouses. In this way, the identity of objects in the social world can be seen as falling under the same general rubric as the identity of objects in the ordinary material world. Such an account is then able to deal with problems common to the material and the social sphere. Thus, just as one might wonder how two non-identical material things could be constituted by the same matter at a given time, statue and the clay, so one might wonder how two committees could be constituted by the same members at a given time, the library committee and the kitchen committee. And the answer, according to the theory of embodiment, is the same. At any time, the material thing or the committee is manifested as a rigid embodiment, which is the same in the objects it relates, but different in how they are related. So there's a difference in the form, and that accounts for the difference in the objects, even though the underlying matter is the same. The clay in the case of the statue, or the members of the respective committees in the social case. In this lecture, I would like to discuss four main topics that to a large extent are peculiar to the case of social groups. So the problems I'm discussing tend not to arise in the material sphere. These are, I call them location, mixed character, social holism, and structure. The first, location, concerns the question of the location of social groups. The second, mixed character, the question of how, if at all, a social group is able to sustain such heterogeneous forms of predication. I'll discuss this later as to what I mean by that. The third, that social holism, is concerned with the familiar question of whether social phenomena are somehow reducible to individualistic or non-social phenomena. And the fourth, which is structure, is concerned with the question of how and in what manner a social group is capable of possessing structure. In each case, I shall consider how the theory of embodiment is able to shed light on these questions and add to our general understanding of social groups. I'm aware that there are a number of alternative views concerning the identity of social groups. They could be taken to be pluralities, for example, or sets, or sums of stages. There are familiar reasons for not holding such views in the case of ordinary material things, and in what follows, I shall suppose that similar reasons obtain in the case of social groups. So it's not my concern here to go over this territory. Thus, my aim is not to argue against these alternative views, but to consider the implications of my own view. So you just pretend that you're on board here. Okay. However, I would like to think that its ability to shed light on some of these further questions provides additional support for the view. I think it does a great explanatory job. So location. We face a familiar problem concerning the location of social groups or organizations. I think maybe Rubin was the first person. I've got 1983 here to identify this issue. Consider All Souls College. It is composed, at least in part, by its fellows. But it is not usually, even in part, where its fellows are. If all of the fellows decide to vacation in Corsica, the college will remain where it always has been, on the high street, and will not also be located on the sunny beaches of Corsica. Yet surely, if an object is at a given time composed of other objects, then it should at least share in the location of the objects at that time. So how can the fellows help compose the college, and yet the college not be, at least in part, where the fellows are? Not only is this an intuitive difficulty, it's also a difficulty for my theory of embodiment. For I take the college at any moment of its existence to be manifested by a rigid embodiment, which will be composed of various individuals, including the fellows, standing in various relationships to one another. And there's a principle of location for rigid embodiments, which says the rigid embodiments will be where the component individuals are. And so by this principle, the variable embodiment, which is the college, will at least at that given time be where the fellows are. So thus my theory incorrectly predicts the college is where the fellows are. So the college, in my view, is this variable embodiment. The variable embodiment at a given time will be where its manifestation, where the manifestation of the variable embodiment is at time. That manifestation is a rigid embodiment, partly composed of the fellows. That rigid embodiment will be where the fellows are, and the fellows are in Corsica right now, but the college isn't. So my theory actually makes an incorrect prediction. How is this difficult to be solved? And I should mention that this has actually called for a change in the theory as I originally adumbrated it, which arose from my thinking about this sort of case. Let's say that an object is spatial if it has a location in space, or maybe we should say it's the kind of thing that has a location in space, and temporal if it exists in time. A spatial object will presumably be temporal, though a temporal object need not be spatial. This classification of objects might somewhat controversially be extended to worldly objects, which exist within a modal dimension, that is within worlds, or to all objects, whatever, which may not exist within a world. So you might think that sets have a kind of extra-worldly existence. They're in some sense transcendent. Of course, people have had similar views about God. I would like to suggest that when one object is composed of other objects, those objects may be designated as having a certain status as spatial or temporal, or worldly, if you like, and unworldly. If you like, we can imagine that each operation of composition has a certain signature, which indicates the status of the objects as spatial or temporal or worldly. So when I sum some objects, I designate whether this object is spatial or temporal or what have you. Suppose now that we form a whole from two other objects, where one has the status of being a spatial part and the other of being a temporal part. At any given time, the whole will then have as its location the location of the spatial part, not of the temporal part. And this will hold even if the temporal part is in fact a spatial object. So we're treating this spatial object as a merely temporal object, as it were. We're not taking into account the fact that it is a spatial object, because this is a kind of summation that's just looking at the temporal profile of the object, not as its spatial profile. It just happens to be that this object also has a spatial profile. We are now in a position to solve the difficulty. From a purely intuitive point of view, All Souls College will be composed at a given time, let us say, both by the building on Broad Street and by its fellows. But the building will be a spatial part, while the fellows will be at best merely temporal parts. Thus, even though they have a physical presence, and even though they help compose their college, their physical presence does not contribute to the physical presence of the college. They are indeed souls. Okay. Forgive that pun. Okay. From the more theoretical point of view, All Souls College, that's from the intuitive point of view, All Souls College will be manifested at any given time by a rigid embodiment, which is composed of the fellows in the building. But in the formation of the rigid embodiment, the fellows will be designated as temporal parts, while the building will be designated as a spatial part. The rigid embodiment will therefore be where the building is, and it's not necessarily where the fellows are. And similarly for the corresponding variable embodiment, which gets manifested as these rigid embodiments. There is nothing in the rule for forming a structured whole which dictates the status of the parts. Depending on the kind of whole in question, there are different things we might take to constitute its physical presence. Thus, whereas, as we have seen, the college is where its buildings are, a team, presumably, will be where its members are. If they go to Corsica, then the team will also be in Corsica, even if they had some headquarters in Manchester or wherever it might be. Some cases, such as an academic department, may even have an ambiguous identity. I mean, if members of the NYU philosophy department go to Corsica, I think you could go either way as to where the department is. But the ambiguity is not, as is commonly thought to be, in whether the object should be taken to be the people or the buildings, but in which of these should be taken to contribute to the physical presence of the whole. It has to do with what I call the signature of the rigid embodiment, which in each case is composed both of the people and the building. As has commonly been noted, the fact that the members of a social group or institution may not contribute to its physical presence is a significant difference between social objects and ordinary material objects. And there's perhaps some deep explanation for this, which I don't have. The parts of an ordinary material object are all equally material, or spatial parts. However, it seems to me that the social objects are not the only objects of this sort, where we don't necessarily have the physical presence of its constituents. Consider the set whose members are Trump and Kim. This set, I'm sorry to bring up this person, but anyway, there it is. You might have thought you could forget about him, but no, okay. This set, in my opinion, is a special kind of whole composed of two politicians, if that's not too polite a term. But the set does not even exist in space and time. It's a non-spaceless, timeless, and also, I would say, an unworldly object. Thus, Trump and Kim will not be spatial or temporal parts of the set, and their physical presence will in no way contribute to the physical presence of the set. So the set isn't where Trump and Kim are, even though they help compose the set. Frege complained to Russell, this had to do with Russell's view of singular propositions, which actually contain the objects that they're about, and which we can think have propositional attitudes towards. Frege complained to Russell that Mont Blanc, with its snowfields, is not itself a component part of the thought that Mont Blanc is more than 4,000 meters high. The thought here is what we would call a proposition. Perhaps one thing that made it seem so absurd to Frege that Mont Blanc should be part of the thought proposition is that the proposition would then have to share in the spatial and temporal presence of Mont Blanc. It would have to be partly where they were. The proposition must be over there. But just as Trump, in all its physical grandeur, can be a non-spatial and timeless part of a set, so Mont Blanc, with all its snowfields, can be a non-spatial and timeless part of the proposition. So I want to apply the same doctrine to the case of propositions and sets. So I come to this second problem, which is of mixed character. The character of an embodiment has to do with its characteristic features. When does the embodiment exist and where? What is it like? And how does it behave? Okay. In my earlier work, I discussed two kinds of characteristic feature. There were general features, which could be determined on the basis of a general rule, and special features, which could only be determined on the basis of rules which were specific to the kind of object in question. Location is an example of a general feature. The location of an object is given in a general way by the location of the object's spatial parts. Color is an example of a special feature. The color of an object depends in a highly unsystematic way on the object's kind. The color of a grapefruit is the color of its flesh, the color of a house, the color of its roof, the color of a biro, the color of its ink, and so on. So there's no general rule in these cases. Unless it's a very high-level rule that has to do with our interests and so on and so forth. It would be a mistake to think that when I say that a house is red, what I am really saying is that the roof is red, as if what the house really referred to is its roof. I said the house is red, but I should have said its roof is red. Or that what red really means in this context is having a red roof. Or I said the house was red, but what I should have said is the house has a red roof. No. For what it is for a house to be red is simply for its roof to be red. When I say my car and my house are both red, it is not as if there's an ambiguity in my use of the term red. And when I say I walked into a red house, it is not as if house is being used ambiguously to denote the roof of the house and the building. There's no felt ambiguity in these cases. Okay. I feel tempted to make a remark here about how philosophers, when they're in a fix, they have a particular view as to how things should be. And then they accuse us of ordinary people of speaking improperly when it doesn't conform with what they think should be true. So they say, strictly speaking, this isn't the case. When there's absolutely no linguistic evidence that this is the case, that this is so. Okay. If I'm very disappointed, so few people here, I say, no one's here. Well, that's not strictly true. Okay. We can all recognize that. If someone says, the philosopher says to you, that's not strictly true that the house is red, none of us detect any kind of oddity. There's not a similar feeling that we have. But strictly, it's not red. Okay. We'll come across another example of this. But it's very common for philosophers just to make up a story about how ordinary language works because it doesn't fit in with their philosophical views. I doubt that this is a common mistake in the case of ordinary material things, but it is a mistake made over and over again in connection with social groups and institutions. Here is a typical, this is very common. Here is a typical quotation on the subject, which is from Rubin. We sometimes use France to denote a geographical area. As for example, if I say we visited France last summer. On the other hand, we sometimes use France to denote a social entity which cannot be identified with any particular geographical area. As for example, if I say France is a charter member of the United Nations. Okay. So Rubin's saying, sometimes use France to refer, the term France to refer to one thing, sometimes to refer to another thing. Chomsky has gone even further and used data of this sort to argue, not for ambiguous reference, but for the absence of reference altogether. But I do not believe the linguistic data supports any such conclusions. The entity which the person visited is the very same entity which became a charter member of the United Nations. For what it is to visit a country is to go to its geographical area. and what it is for a country to be a charter member is for its state to become a charter member. I'm not even sure that it's only strictly or properly true to say that the roof is red. Someone says, oh, strictly speaking, it's the roof that's red. Or it's only strictly speaking correct to say that one visited the area. For a roof is only red insofar as its outer surface is red. It doesn't have to be red all through. And one visits an area only insofar as one visits certain of its parts. So why is the one the strict or proper use and the other not? I mean, I don't even know what the strict or proper use of red would be, actually. What really drives these conclusions, it seems to me, is not the linguistic data, which in itself provides no evidence either for ambiguity or for absence of reference, but certain ontological misgivings. It is thought that no entities can possibly play the role that the putative referents are called upon to play. That no single entity can, for example, be one that is both a visited and a charter member of the United Nations. The thought is, oh, I only can visit a geographical area. Only some purely social entity can be a charter member of the United Nations. Okay. And what in its turn derives these misgivings, these ontological misgivings, is an unduly narrow conception of what objects there could be. Thus, it is thought that if it is thought that all entities are fusions of ordinary material things, then there seems to be no place for an entity to be one to which one can go, which presumably it must be some kind of landmass, and an entity which can enter into political relationships. What's something, there may be other views that can do this, but what something like the theory of embodiment helps us to see is that these ontological misgivings are misguided. Once we allow for a rich abundance in the way objects can come together to form wholes, we may also allow for a rich abundance in the properties by which they may be characterized, because this is complex whole, and as it were, the predicate can focus on one aspect of the whole rather than another. So we're not just dealing with a landmass or some sort of abstract political entity. We're dealing with this complex thing. Thus, a country can at a given time be a structured whole that includes a geographical area and a political state as parts, with the one relevant to where it is and the other relevant to the political relationships into which it can enter. The theory of embodiment shows how there need be no incoherence in admitting such hybrid objects into our ontology. And once such an expansive ontology is admitted, the previous misgivings over reference will disappear. Okay. So the next question has to do with social holism. According to one form of social holism, not every social fact is grounded in non-social facts. There are, in this sense, irreducibly social facts. The issue of social holism is usually centered on the behavior of social groups or institutions. Can a group decision, for example, be grounded in the decisions of its individual members, or some other kind of propositional attitudes they may have? But there is also an issue concerning the very existence of social groups. I would like to elaborate on this, and I'd also like to show how within something like the theory of embodiment, it gives rise to a further issue of holism, one concerning the identity of social objects rather than the facts about them. So I'm going to distinguish two kinds of holism. There's the ground theoretic one, which I've just talked about, and there's an essentialist one as well. Suppose a department is wondering whether to set up a grievance committee, and suppose the bylaws of the department include the rule that no committee can be formed without the consent of the department. What then does it take? What are the grounds for such a committee to exist? Presumably, part of what it takes is that the department should consent to the formation of such a committee. That's what the bylaws specify. Some philosophers may worry about what it is for the department to consent to such a thing. But let us suppose that the bylaws stipulate that this is simply a matter of majority consent. Each member of a majority should consent. The problem is not now with their consent, but its content. What's the content of their consent? This is that a grievance committee be formed. A grievance committee, so there's an existential quantifier. Where the committees in question, that is, the committees over which the quantifier range, presumably include the very committee that is to be formed. If it didn't, it wouldn't help for them to consent to a committee being formed. It better include the committee that actually is formed, otherwise they wouldn't have consented to it. Thus, the grounds for the existence of the committee will indirectly involve reference to the very committee itself. So they have to consent to a committee being formed. So the content of the consent involves this existential quantifier, a committee. The existential quantifier ranges over committees, including that very committee. That's what I meant by the indirect reference. It's secured through a quantifier. Suppose that the bylaws also stipulate that no committee will last more than a year without the consent of the department. Thus, what would it take for the committee to continue to exist once the year is up? Presumably, part of what it would take is that the department, that is a majority of its members, consent to its continued existence. Yes, we consent. The content of their consent is now that that very committee continue to exist. That's what they're consenting to, that that very committee continue to exist. Thus, the ground for the continued existence of the committee will directly involve reference to that very committee, because now they're consenting to a singular proposition, a proposition concerning that very committee. Okay. These strike me as completely straightforward facts, actually. It should be noted that we are not here simply adopting the kind of position advocated by Gilbert, and in fact I think the two other people here are perhaps adopt a similar position, Michael Bratman and Tmela. I'll quote back Gilbert on this, according to which a social group's existence is basically a matter of the members of a set of people being conscious that they are linked by a special tie. Actually, in this case, it's not the members of the committee. They could have been in the minority. It's likely they're in the minority and the majority got them to form the committee. But anyway, for I'm suggesting that in certain cases, that special, I'm going further, that special tie will involve reference to the kind of group, or even to the very group that is in question. So I'm pointing out that that attitude involves a certain kind of circularity. Thus, the group or the kind itself figures in the mental connections by which the members of the group are related. So that's the point I wish to emphasize. These mental connections are presumably social facts, fact about the social attitudes of the group, or at least facts which the individualist opponent of social holism will also want to ground in non-social facts. I assume he'll be somewhat embarrassed, he or she will be somewhat embarrassed by these facts. The individualist therefore faces the problem of how they are to be grounded. Okay. I think this is a very, very severe issue. This issue is to some extent a problem for any reductive view. Suppose I want to get rid of chairs in favor of particles. Yeah. So the chair exists means these particles are arranged in a chairish way. Okay. Then presumably I also want to get rid of our thoughts about chairs. Okay. And how do we do that? Because I didn't have thoughts about, when I think the chair's over there, I'm not thinking that the particles are arranged chairwise. Okay. However, the problem is especially pressing within the social sphere for a number of different reasons. For one thing, the problem arises not just for the attitudinal facts, but also for the non-attitudinal facts, since the grounds for the non-attitudinal facts will involve the attitudinal facts. That's not true with the chair. Whether the chair's over there doesn't involve us thinking that the chair's over there. But whether the committee exists does depend upon people having an attitude towards its existence. It's not therefore possible to sequester the two problems, as is the common practice in other areas, and treat the problem of ground for the non-attitudinal facts without regard for how the attitudinal facts might be grounded. So the one problem, the non-attitudinal one, involves the other. In the second place, it seems to be especially difficult in the social case to provide an adequate substitute for the attitudinal facts. Suppose that the department consents to certain members meeting on a regular basis to discuss grievances that are brought to them. Okay, yeah, go ahead, do it. This then, it seems to me, does not amount to the department consenting to the formation of a departmental committee. No committee has been formed. Some people just got together to discuss grievances. since this requires that they regard the members of the department who meet in this manner as constituting such a committee. I don't see how, as it were, that there's a formal arrangement here which has not been made. For to be a departmental committee is in part to be, at least when given how the bylaws are written, is in part to be so regarded. There must be this consent to a committee, not just people meeting, doing certain things. And this response-dependence character of what it is to be a committee seems to get in the way of a more straightforward, committee-less characterization of the content of the consent. As you try to substitute some other content for the consent, it never quite seems enough. Finally, and most significantly, these issues over existence give shape and substance to a different form of holism, what one might call identity-based rather than fact-based holism. A previous fact-based form of holism denied that all social facts are grounded in non-social facts. It's therefore a view about the ground or basis of social facts. Identity-based holism, on the other hand, denies that all objects, social objects, have an identity that can be specified in terms of non-social objects. It's therefore a view about the identity or nature of social objects. So one concerns ground, the other concerns essence or nature. Under the theory of embodiment and other views of this sort, the two forms of holism will be connected, since questions concerning the existence of social objects will turn on questions concerning their identity. Suppose for simplicity that a committee is, by its very nature, a rigid embodiment. It consists in certain individuals connected in a certain way. This is a simplification. The rigid embodiment will then exist just in case the individuals are connected in this way. In other words, the identity, the specification of the identity of this rigid embodiment goes along with conditions for its existence. Okay, the two are just linked in that way. Thus, if the connection involves indirect reference to committees, then the identity of the committee would also appear to involve indirect reference to committees. We cannot say what the committee is without appeal to a domain of social objects, which includes the very committee. Okay. Because I talk about what the committee is meant to be the structured whole, the members are related in a certain way, and part of the way they must be related is that the department consents to them constituting the committee, that very committee, or at least a committee. So what I want to say is, if you actually ask now about the continued existence of the committee, that involves consent to its continued existence. And so when we specify what the committee is, we have to say it is an entity whose continued existence, that is after a year, will depend upon the department consenting to its continued existence. Okay. So, in other words, this is a very familiar kind of case in which the grounds for the existence of the object are built into its very identity. This is a very common characteristic, that it's built into the very identity of the object that its existence should have certain grounds. And that's certainly how it is if you treat these objects as embodiments, and it may well be true for other accounts too. It turns out that these two forms of circularity have their analogues in the philosophy of mathematics. Thus, I might define the set of natural numbers to be the smallest set of objects which includes zero and is closed under successor. That's Frege's famous definition. Thus, in defining the set of natural numbers, I appeal to a domain of sets which includes the very set to be defined. Among those sets, of which I take the smallest, is the set of natural numbers. Or I might define a set to be one whose sole member is itself. There's something called ill-founded set theory in which there is such a set. It's a set whose sole member is itself. The self-singleton. Thus, in defining the set, I appear to make reference to that very set. Thus, the first is a case of what's called impredicativity, in which a mathematical object is defined in terms of a domain of objects to which it belongs. The second is a case of ill-foundedness, in which the definition of a mathematical object appears to involve a loop or regress. And in both cases, there appears to be some sort of circularity in the account of what the object is. Whether the circularity, I'm talking about the mathematical case now, is vicious is another matter. This issue has been hotly debated in the philosophy of mathematics, but it's commonly assumed that a realist stance in which the mathematical objects are already out there would justify both forms of definition. So if there already are all these sets, for example, then I can perfectly legitimately define the set of natural numbers as the smallest set that contains 0 and is closed under successor. Similarly, if there are self-singletons, then I can define the self-singleton as a set whose sole member is itself. Okay. So it's usually been thought that a realist stance would justify these forms of circular definition. It's also commonly assumed that an anti-realist stance, in which the mathematical objects are not already out there, but somehow the result of construction, would nullify both forms of definition. For in defining the set of numbers or the self-singleton, I cannot presuppose that the set is already there, but must somehow construct it from what is already given. So I don't have the set yet of the natural numbers. So I can't presuppose that I do have it in saying what it is. And a set has to be constructed from what I already have, but then I don't already have, self-singleton, I don't already have that set. So I can't construct that set from itself. Okay. The mathematical case might make the prospects for combining, so I'm suggesting that in the social sphere, we have both kinds of circularity, just as we do in mathematics. The mathematical case might make the prospects for combining an identity-based holism in the social sphere with an anti-realist or reductive attitude towards social objects look pretty dim. Okay. But there is, in fact, a very significant difference between the two cases. For in the social case, the reference to the objects whose identity is in question is always made within the context of an attitude. The department must consent to a committee or to the continued existence of the committee. The object or objects hide behind a mental barrier, so to speak. They do not have a full existence. I'm speaking very metaphorically here. They do not have a full existence, but only a partial form of existence in the mind. It's as if, so to speak, they only need to exist in the minds of the people, not in actuality. Okay. And this may lead one to suspect that a fully realist attitude towards them is not required for the various forms of circular definition to be in good order. So what I want to say is that even though in the mathematical case, you might think accepting these forms of circular definition requires a realist attitude, this isn't so clear in the social case, because whenever you have these forms of circularity, the objects are always taken to exist, so to speak, in the minds of the people. Now, I'm just pointing to a difference. A lot of work would need to be done still to show that we could still adopt an anti-realist attitude towards these objects. Okay. I wonder if okay. Let me just say something about this, because I think it relates to what other people have said. I think this issue of circularity is of great methodological importance. Let me just consider a somewhat different example. This actually, I thought about this in connection with Scott Shapiro's talk when he raised the question of the unity of a legal system. How come these laws are all laws of the same system? Let's consider a simpler question, which is what makes these chapters of the same thesis? We've had people at NYU are simultaneously writing a thesis for Oxford and for NYU. So they have all these chapters. So what makes these chapters the ones for the NYU thesis and those chapters the chapters for Oxford? You might think, well, if they're in the same folder or something like that. But no, because the person could have accidentally put them in the same folder. Even if he didn't put them accidentally in the same folder, he may have put them in the same folder. He may have deliberately put them in the same folder, but just to deceive people as to what the contents of the thesis are, and so on and so forth. Okay. what makes these chapters, the chapters of NYU thesis, is the students say so. That's all it takes. He says, these are the chapters for the NYU thesis. They are. Now, what's the content of his say-so? That these are the chapters of this thesis. That is, this very circularity I'm talking about is involved, where the content of the stipulation involves the very object. Okay. I think that's a very simple case. Let's go to something closer to the legal case. I won't discuss the legal case, which I think involves sort of additional complications. Both Scott and I, Scott belongs to a condo, I suspect. I belong to a co-op, and we both know about how awful these committees are. The rules and regulations governing co-ops and condos are. Let's suppose that there are two kinds of regulations: laundry and garden regulations. And it makes a difference whether it's laundry or garden, because you'll have a double fine for a violation of a laundry regulation. The committee is now deciding on whether it should be forbidden to hang your laundry in the garden. Okay. Now, what makes it the case that this is a laundry regulation rather than a garden regulation? The committees say so. That's all it takes. If they take it to be a laundry regulation, then it is. If they take it to be a garden regulation, then it is. And again, the content of their say-so involves that body of regulations. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that many of these questions we ask in the social sciences, like the unity of law or what have you, involve these attitudes in a circular way. That is, the attitudes themselves are directed towards the very objects. Okay. I suspect that in the legal case, there's something, again, highly stipulative about what it is for the laws to be the laws of a single body of law. Okay. I think this is of methodological importance for two different reasons. One is that it suggests that rather in avoiding circularity, this kind of circularity, we should embrace it. Embrace circularity, as long as it's of this relatively benign sort, where the circularity gets hidden, as I say, behind this mental barrier. Okay. Because then we can separate two tasks. One is getting an analysis allowing ourselves this sort of circularity, from the task of then trying, if we want to, we may not want to, of trying to eliminate that circularity. Okay. Now, I think what tends to happen is this. People think circularity, oh, terrible. So there are two possible responses. One is to weaken the mental content. Oh, I can't refer to this very entity, so I have to refer to something else instead, and then you get something that's too weak. And the other mistake that I think is often made is to try to substitute some substantive criterion, not stipulative or mental, that will somehow do the trick. In the first case, it seems to me you get something that's too weak, the mental attitude is simply not strong enough. In the other case, we get something that's too strong. Whatever the substantive criteria might be, there's no reason why in any particular case they should be satisfied. Okay. So in the case of the thesis, wouldn't do to say that the person just believes that these chapters hang together, because he or she might think they hang together for all kinds of different reasons. Nor would it do, this is a substantive criterion, to say that the thesis should have some kind of unity in content, because the person may have messed up and written two highly disunified theses. Okay, if only sorted them out another way, they would have been much better, but anyway. Okay, so anyway, that's my little methodological sermon. So I have a bit more time, so I'm going to talk about the final problem, which is structure. Social groups and institutions have structure. A family is structured by its division into parents and children, a committee by its various members, office holders, responsibilities, accompanied by such things as buildings, personnel, and departments. The elements of a structure may themselves have structure, as when the department of a company is structured into sub-departments, each with its own substructure. Philosophers sometimes draw a distinction between structured and unstructured social groups. An example is Ritchie, who distinguishes between type 1 groups, such as committees and organizations, which are structured and require volitional membership and some kind of shared intentionality, from type 2 groups, such as racial or ethnic groups, which do not possess any of these characteristics. But the relevant distinction, it seems to me, is not between some or no structure, but between more or less structure. For the common possession of a racial or ethnic feature, perhaps even by Ritchie's own lights, I don't know, should itself be taken to constitute a minimal form of structure. So structure doesn't have to be relational. Nor, it seems to me, should the difference between type 1 and type 2 groups be regarded as a difference in kind, as I think Ritchie thinks maybe, is she here? Yes, very good. You can, if I'm wrong, let me know, please. Okay. I wasn't actually sure whether you know, anyway, difference in kind, what does that mean? But it's some kind of fundamental difference in kind. Since one would expect social groups with a more complex underlying structure to be capable of more complex forms of behavior. So merely they are capable of more complex forms of behavior, there's no reason to think they're different in kind. It's like a more or less complex machine. There's not therefore a simple division between one kind of group and the other, but a continuum of groups of more or less complexity, and Brian, I think, has made a similar point. I think nor should it be supposed that the structure of a social group will remain the same over time. Perhaps some groups are like this. A family, for example, would be structured by its division into parents and children. And even if the number of children change, there will still be a sense in which the underlying structure remains the same. However, a company, and this actually happens, could greatly change its organization over time as it absorbs new companies or sheds subdivisions or introduces new departments. Or a country could greatly change its system of government after a revolution, and there appears to be no reasonable sense in which the structure of these entities remains the same. One might even imagine the society, the inconstants, who make it their policy to radically change the structure of their society from one year to the next, though they better keep the policy of being an inconstant. The very existence of the group in this case would depend upon a continual change in structure. We may, at least in the first instance, I actually don't have time for this. How much more time do I have? Couple of minutes, okay. I'm going to, okay. There are ways of representing this structure, and I'm not going to go into this. But I actually agree more or less with how Karen Ritchie has characterized the structure in terms of this sort of relational graph. Okay. Where, you know, I could draw a little picture where you've got the father and the mother and the children, and we could connect them by links indicating the relationships between them. The question I want to ask is how a group has structure. What kind of object must a group be if it's be capable of having a well-defined macroscopic structure and not just be an amorphous aggregate of atoms? Okay, so a family isn't just this amorphous aggregate of atoms. It's actually structured into parents and children. The theory of embodiment yields a straightforward answer to this question, which is not readily available under alternative views. For a relational structure may be associated with each rigid embodiment, because a rigid embodiment is just certain entities structured a certain way. That's what it is. And so given that a social group is a variable embodiment that is manifested over time by various rigid embodiments, we can take its structure at any time to be the structure of the rigid embodiment at that time. Okay. So the above application of the theory of embodiment is not only able to explain how a social group has structure, but also why the structure is intrinsic to the group. So there seems to be a clear sense in which the structure of a family is intrinsic to the group. It's not as if someone just sort of labeled this guy father and this person mother and child, And it's only on that basis of the labeling that we could say that this is how things are. It's intrinsic to the family itself that it be structured in this way. There are two main ways in which we can talk about the structure being intrinsic. In the first place, the structure is internal to the group. For the group appears to be a whole whose component parts are related within the whole via the various structural links. So this is actually the structure is actually an aspect, an intrinsic aspect of the whole. Okay. In the second place, and this is how it is with the theory of original embodiment, in the second place, the structure is essential. It is essential to most groups that they have a particular structure or a particular kind of structure. It is essential to a family, for example, that it be composed of a parent or parents and their children, if they have any. But again, this follows from our view, from the fact that rigid embodiments are essentially structured in the way they are. I mean, that's what the family is. So it's essential to it that it be structured in this way. If you just took a chair to be this sum of atoms, there would be nothing essential to its having a seat and arms and so on and so forth. That would just be one way among many of dividing up the atoms. Okay. Okay. Of course, these facts about structure are also true of most material things. Chairs, tables, atoms, molecules. And this might be explained in a similar way, just as I did with the chair. The special character of social groups lies not in the fact of linkage, we have these links everywhere, but in the nature of the links. What normally accounts for the structural unity of an ordinary material object is some kind of physical cohesion. I guess it's true of also most scientific material objects as well. But what normally accounts for the unity of a social group is not physical cohesion, but social cohesion. And what to a large extent accounts for the social cohesion is the self-reflexive character of the group. Like a Leibnizian monad, the group itself is mirrored in the minds of its members. And it is the shared thought that this is our association, our congregation, our nation, our social ontology group, that as much as anything holds the group and its members together. Thank you.
Okay. Please, I'm going to give you the first microphone first. Great. It's on now. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is about problem 3, and in particular this problem of grounding the attitudinal facts. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of attracted to the idea that in consenting to the formation of a committee, what we're consenting to is certain rights, duties, obligations holding between certain people. For example, these people now have this obligation to meet every so often and to decide certain matters and so on. And so I'm wondering what you think the problem would be with saying that and going that route.
Well, I guess I think of that as not built into the very identity of a committee. I mean, once the department has formed the committee, they could actually wonder about what rights and obligations the members of the committee should have. And they might say, well, normally, right, the committee members have the right to autonomously decide on the matters before them, but this is so important that we'll ask them to forward whatever they actually, this is standardly done. Is the committee going to make its own decisions, or does it forward recommendations to the department? So it seems to me this is something that could be settled after the committee is formed, and so it shouldn't actually be built into the identity of the committee. So I think this is, again, a case when you're looking for a substantive criterion which builds in too much. And anyway, that would be my own inclination. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I was wondering why you say specifically that groups are material objects and what exactly you mean by that, especially since at the very end of your talk you kind of emphasized that thoughts are in a certain way what connects the group. And I could think of two motivations. One would be that you're a materialist and believe in the mind-body identity theory, and from that point of view, want to say that a group is a material object. But even if we grant the truth of the identity theory, which I wouldn't be inclined to, it seems to me there's a problem. Then this renders the notion of a material object not very descriptive at all. So then you would only be saying something like it's not a mathematical or formal object or something. Maybe that's what you intend, but one might think one wants to go for something more descriptive. The other motivation might be that you think, okay, it's not a mental entity, so it has to be a material or bodily entity, but I think that is also questionable because that assumes a certain kind of mind-body dualism, and people have sometimes argued specifically with reference to social entities that they straddle this mind-body dualism, such as Searle has argued, like a university or money is neither mental nor physical, or you might think a word or a meaning is neither something mental nor physical. So I was wondering, then there's an alternative, like broadly Strawsonian view, that you might say a person, for example, is something that is as such neither mental nor physical, but has properties of both kinds. And then one might think a group belongs essentially in the same ontological category as a person, rather than a material object or something purely mental. So I was wondering why, so what do you mean exactly by material object, and why is it important for you to say it's a material object?
Well, it's very kind of you to offer all of these alternatives on my behalf. I never said, as far as I'm aware, that these social groups were material. What I believe is that...
You did not? Okay.
No, I don't think so.
I think at the very beginning of your talk you certainly said that, but...
I did?
Okay. I don't... yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter in any case, I mean...
Okay. What I think is that it's often appropriate to talk about where a group is, where all souls is. Yeah. Okay. And groups have members, often, usually, I guess, and those members are often physical things. A group of angels, I guess, could be a social group, and it wouldn't be physical. So no, I'm not committed. I didn't want to say that they're material. Yeah. I wouldn't want to get into debate as to about dualism or all that stuff. I mean, I just want to deal with I try to avoid these sort of more general issues. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, over here. Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you said.
Did I get you wrong?
No, I think
Okay.
you got me roughly right. Yeah, so we should chat more about what I think about those different kinds of groups now. I do think that structure is relevant to both, but that it's not always internal structure. Like, I think there's external structure in some of these cases. But as a question, so I was wondering, so right at the end you were talking about the nature of the links, and you said they're self-reflexive in character.
Normally, yeah. That I thought that was the sort of the general, what made social groups so very special. The self-reflexive character, yeah.
Yeah. So that seems. I mean, it certainly seems.
Sorry, not in all cases. Not in all cases.
Okay, I thought you were saying that was distinctive. That was like. Okay. Yeah. So that was. Yeah. So I was inclined to think that even in some. So while in some cases.
Yeah, like
there is.
There's no reason for many groups. There's no reason for them to have this self-reflexive character.
Okay. Good. I agree. Right, so it seems like both, they needn't be self-reflexive, like in cases of ethnic groups or racial groups or maybe class. And then it also seemed to me like there might be something closer to the kind of picture you want for like the car engine, where there's something more like defined roles where they're integrated in particular ways. So that seems to me like a group structure that's not self-reflexive.
What kind of case do you have in mind?
Like a committee. So a committee that has a treasurer and a secretary and a president. So there's these different defined roles. They relate to one another in particular ways. That gives you the kind of organizational structure of the entity. They might also know that they're members of the group, but like a lot of what matters in the structure there is sort of how these individuals are related. Like you might think the parts of a car engine, like part of the structure is sort of thinking through how these parts.
You know, I made a Weasley statement because, you know, because I didn't say this is always true, right? So, and also I think when I talk about physical cohesion in the material case, I don't think that's always true. I mean, you've got a galaxy or something like that. I don't know to what extent that's, you know, you can arbitrarily draw boundaries to define a material object. How to articulate, let's say it's an important characteristic of many objects in the social world that they have this self-reflexive character. Similarly, it's a very important characteristic of many objects in the material world that they have this other kind of character, namely in terms of physical cohesiveness. So all I'm doing is drawing attention to that. And I certainly don't want to make a universal claim. Okay. Yeah. Exactly how to make the claim. I could make a very weak claim. Some objects are like this. Okay, that's somehow too weak. All objects like this are somehow too strong. There's somewhere in the middle that I want to, but how exactly to state it? You know? But you know, we're often in that position, right? We somehow think this is an important class, subgroup, you know.
Yeah. But
we don't know quite how to say it. But anyway, that's the position I'm in. But thank you for making my embarrassment over this. It's so evident, yes.
Yeah, my name is Frank Hendricks. So I own a house. Now that as such may not interest you. However, universities...
You should own a co-op. You should be in a co-op.
Yeah, well, it's kind of. But anyway. So your university owns a building. Now, I understood you as saying that the building of the university, probably the main building of the university, is a part of the university. But my house is not a part of me. So, the ownership relation seems to be the same, that between an agent and an object. Yeah. So why would the building be part of the university?
Well, actually, you know, there's this thing from Graal where someone asked where the university is, and it's meant to be a bad question. I don't think it is a bad question, actually, because the university is all over Oxford, actually. If you ask where Tufts is, it's you know, we're here. I guess Tufts is a college rather than it's not. It's a university. See, I'm sorry. Okay, embarrass myself again. Okay. I just want to say that for some reason, we say this is where Tufts is, you know, where the buildings are. And for some reason, we don't say where your house is. What the deep reason for this might be, I don't know. I suspect it has something to do that you're most intimately related to your body rather than to your home. That this is in the privileged, very privileged sense of ownership, what you own. And the buildings of the university which it owns, I guess you own your body in a certain sense, are what correspond to your body. So just as you are where your body is, the university is where its buildings are. So I take it that to be the explanation. So there's ownership and ownership. Sometimes you own things that are not where you are, and sometimes you do.
Thank you, Kit. Enjoyed it so much. Hylomorphism all the way.
Very good.
So my question is a bit connected to Kate's question, and it was sort of, I was going to be more that one, and then she asked it. But I'm interested in sort of the scope of your account. You talk about social groups and institutions, but in the social domain, it seems to me that there are other kinds of structured wholes like transportation systems and economies and all of these sorts of things that have these kind of functional parts. So the transportation system has the T, it has the bus, it has, you might want to add taxis and things like this. It has an administration, et cetera. And I just wasn't sure whether, but people wouldn't normally say that that's a social group. See, part of what I think that we're getting into here is a background controversy about the materiality of the social. And I'm a believer in the materiality of the social because I think transportation systems are interesting social entities, but some people just want them to be groups of people in their minds. And so, but I was just wondering about, and so even racial groups and things like that, you might end up saying, well, they're composed of people in their minds and they have the self-reflexive capacities and stuff. But transportation systems, no one would say that, or economies. I mean, who the hell knows how the economy works and what the different parts of it are? We need to have social science to figure that out. And so I wasn't sure, and so I want to apply your hylomorphic analysis sort of stuff to these big, social systems and broad structures and stuff like that, but I wasn't sure whether you intended to go that way.
I was inclined to go that way, because actually right at the beginning I said social groups and possibly also social objects is what...
Oh, I heard you saying it's institutional.
No, I said, I hope, I can show you, I have social objects written down. And also, I never said they were material. But,
No, but they have material parts.
They have material parts, yeah. So yeah, I would be inclined to apply the theory across the board. And of course, if I do apply the theory across the board, then I shouldn't say that, as you quite rightly point out, this self-reflexive, that this is a very important characteristic of the whole group. For the most part, no, it's not. It's not. You're quite right. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to the circularity issue. So there's this question, how do we know that these are the members of this group? And you wanted to say we know because kind of someone just says so. So in the thesis
in certain cases, sorry, not all cases.
Okay.
Yeah, not all cases.
Not all cases, at least, that's fine. I want to ask about the cases where that's true. So like the thesis analogy, it's the students say so. So how do we know who say so makes it so, is the question? And then how do we know who say so makes it so that person say so makes it so, and so on? So this, so is it the leader of the group? Is it, so in the committee example, it was a majority. Okay, how do we decide that it's a majority? So I just feel like there's a kind of regress looming here. Can you just say something about that?
Well, it is the student's thesis, after all.
Yep, but in the group case.
I guess that gives him the right to say which chapters. I mean, I'm not sure I can go beyond that sort of obvious thought. So I take it that the circumstances will dictate who has the right.
Norms.
Yes.
Norms.
Yeah. We'll just. I mean.
Okay.
So yeah, and it will be different in different cases. I mean, we could imagine a situation in which it might even be better this way, in which the supervisor, when these people write, several theses at the same time, decides which should be the constitute the thesis, or can decide, So
then it's just going to be really easy to create a group, right? Because we just anyone say so, kind of. If it's the group say so that makes it the case that these are the members of this group, then I don't know. I sort of feel that we haven't escaped circularity somehow. If we're going to say it's always just whatever seems natural in the situation makes it the case that these people are the members of this group. What we want to know is like who's a member of BP? Like, is the janitor a member of BP? Like, for the purposes of conceiving of BP as a thing that acts in the world? Like, that's the really interesting question. And then does BP just get to decide, okay, who within BP gets to decide whether the janitor is in the agent that is BP? I kind of thought that was the question we were trying to answer.
No, I don't think that quite was. The way I was thinking it was taken to be given who the members of the group were or what the chapters of the thesis were. And then we're asking, in virtue of what are they then members of the same group or chapters? I mean, similarly with the problem of personal identity, it's given that these are the experiences of the person, but in virtue of what are they the experiences of of the person, same person. So why are we putting these? Why do we put these in the same bag? So, but I agree. There's a further question,
Sorry, you have to go back.
which is very interesting, as to why initially we might put these people in rather than others. Yeah, and I wasn't really addressing them.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Arto Laitinen is my name. I also have a question about this self-referentiality or the thoughts about the entity. I was wondering about the cases where they are mistaken about the identity of the group. Think of a case where a group of people forms one social entity and they also form another social entity. And suppose there's a group of ice hockey players that form the national team for Finnish under 18 sort of ice hockey team, the national team. And they also enter the competition for ice hockey teams for under 20 years olds. And they themselves regard themselves as one team. And suppose that all the journalists and everyone else regards them as one team. And nonetheless, it seems that there's a reason to distinguish, even though all the thoughts about that team, everyone who thinks about those two teams thinks that they are one team. But nonetheless, I would say that they are mistaken, because they enter in two competitions and so on. So that it seems that it's not always that someone says so, but there can be these structural, or to put it this way, it can be that everyone is mistaken about the identity of the team.
Right. That's a great example. I should say that I never said these things are always determined by say-so. You couldn't do the same thing with the thesis, could you? That the student really has two theses, but it stipulates that all the chapters belong to one thesis. If the student says, if we all think that it's one thesis, that's it, isn't it? So it couldn't. Yeah. So what it shows is, in the case of committees, it's more complicated than say-so. And actually, I said, I looked about the committee for the co-op, and I thought there the say-so really mattered. I thought actually in the legal, I didn't think too hard about the legal case, but I thought it was much more complicated than that, and it wasn't simply a matter of say-so. Because there are other factors determining which body of law or regulation might belong to in the legal case. So I think you're right that there are other cases when it's not simply a matter of say-so. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about empty groups, or groups that can be empty. So like the Supreme Court, all the members could resign, it's empty for a while, and it seems as though it persists even through that time it's empty. Some groups can be empty, some groups can't be empty, it seems to me. And I don't know, there are lots of people who have accounts of groups that don't seem to be able to accommodate that. But I sort of wonder if that is an issue for your account, or what the basis is for enabling certain groups to be empty and not enabling other groups, how that would be accounted.
Okay. Well, original embodiment is these objects, A, B, C, blah, 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 standing in a certain relation R. Okay. And actually I allow there to be no objects on the left. So that would be a case of an empty rigid embodiment. So there wouldn't be any difficulty for me. I guess there would be something on the there would be an R on the right, because all these objects A, B, C that happen to be known would have to be related in a certain way. But that's fine because there aren't any, so it would be presumably vacuously related in the appropriate way. So yeah. Now, why we would allow certain groups to be empty and others not, I don't. I have to think about particular cases to get a real handle on that question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are questions about kind of some I mean, it seems that, like with the case that Arto raised about teams, sometimes you want to say, well, you know, we individuate groups according to when they stop being, when there are no longer any members. That's the end of the existence of a group, and then a new one comes into existence. So, like, some of the cases that I worry about in my Metaphysics of Groups paper are like, there's certain kinds of groups that we set up in such a way that, like a group of street musicians, you know, once they disband on the street and they reassemble later on, that's a different group. But then there are other groups like the Supreme Court that seem to persist, even if they're empty. And so I think a lot of the worry that I've had in terms of how you try to explain the nature of the persistence of groups or the identity of groups over time is trying to give an account of what the sources are of those kinds of characteristics. You know, how to explain why certain kinds of groups are going to persist under certain circumstances, and other groups are not going to persist under those circumstances.
Yeah. Well, the theory does allow for there to be empty groups. It can, as it were, within the ontology that it provides, it can provide for both of these cases. But if you ask why is it that in certain cases we go one way and not in other cases, actually it's not something I've thought about. I suspect there are similar issues with the material objects as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Keynote and the discussion.